As well as translating from English into other languages for you today, you're going to have to translate from New Zealand English into other languages. New Zealand English is peculiar. We have an interesting accent, and I understand in the room there are some people here from Australia, and they will also be able to try to understand a New Zealand accent. I'm going to try and speak very slowly, which is not a natural thing for me to do, I might add. I get so excited about the research that I tend to speak very quickly. So, if there's anything that I say, please put your hand up, as Isabel said, if you do not understand it. I am trying my very best to speak in my very best English with my very best accent. Today, I am going to spend just over an hour summarising for you 20 years of research that John Hattie has done. An hour for 20 years is a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to have to summarise the key points for you. And I know Leanne, in her presentation this afternoon, has done a fabulous job of putting together the key messages from the research, and also many thanks to Isabel for putting together such a wonderful summary of the research and introduction to the research that she sent out to you. With all of those things, hopefully you have all got a good basic understanding of what it is we're talking about. The research included 250 plus million students. That's a lot of students. It also included about 50,000 studies, and I'm going to summarise them in 1 hour. I want to start, though, by talking about some of the headlines that come out of the visible learning research. And a lot of people say that visible learning is about numbers. It's about this thing that I'm going to talk about today called effect sizes. And I'm going to explain the notion of effect sizes, particularly to those of you who don't know that concept at all. But visible learning is a lot more than effect sizes and numbers. It's about the story that we put around the numbers, and it's the way we think about the work that we do as educators. And I want to present that story to you today. In the first part of my presentation, I'm going to go through the research itself. I've pulled out of the 50,000 studies some of the highlights, some of the things that I know might resonate most with you here in Asia. I'm going to then follow that by talking about the mind frames that we might have as educators, about changing the way we think in terms of getting the best outcomes for our students. Before I do that, though, I want you to get a clear picture in your mind of what I mean and what we mean in the research and the work we do about visible learning. Isabel suggested to you that visible learning is very difficult to translate into Chinese. We also talk a lot in our work about learners. With the work that we're doing in Scandinavia at the moment, they have no word for learner. So overcoming some of the language issues is really interesting for us in the work that we do internationally. So I want to show you what a visible learner looks like. I want to show you what a visible learning school looks like. I want to show you what a visible learning school leader looks like. You're going to listen in the video to some New Zealand students talking about learning and what it means for them. I am going to after the video, I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that they've said to translate it for you. We have put subtitles or words on the screen so you can get an idea of what the students are talking about. The video is filmed in a school in New Zealand called Stonefield School. It's important that you understand the name of the school because Stonefield School is in an old quarry, and you'll see the relevance of that when you hear the students talking about their learning. The video is introduced by the school principal, and that is a lady called Sarah Martin. Sarah Martin embodies everything that we in the Visible Learning research say has the biggest impact on student achievement. This school is a visible learning school, and these students are visible learners. So as you watch the video, I want you to think about the questions on the screen. What are these students able to do that surprised you and maybe might have made you feel a little bit uncomfortable? And a lot of people watch this video and they go, no, I'm not so sure about this. And then I want you to think about the schools that you work with in your context and think, is this what it would look like if you went into a school in your country, in your region, in your city today? So a little bit of context for the school. Sarah started the school 2 years ago. She talks about when she started the school, she interviewed the students and she asked them what makes a good learner a good learner. What did they say? Sitting up straight on the mat, doing what the teacher said. Sarah said that the students had no idea of what learning actually meant. Since then, they have worked together as a team of teachers. They have collaborated to actually develop that language for learning in the school, which is communicated strongly to the students. Within 8 months, we filmed that video 8 months after the school had started. When the students went to that school, they had very little of that language, if any. They've done things like, you saw the wee boy saying, we make connections, connect ideas together to make big ideas. They use a lot of signs and symbols, particularly for the younger students, to actually get those ideas. A lot of visual clues as well and cues for students for how to understand the language of learning. It's from the very young students like Ben, who was talking to his mother about the beehives and his progress in reading, right through to the secondary high school students who were also talking about how they're using the information from the teacher to go back and check their work. So, we also heard in there the high school teacher talking about the students using Moodle, because they can go onto the Moodle site and they can actually check all of the learning and what the learning is like and the plan. And then at the end of the video, and I'm very aware that Murato, who was the little boy, one of the little boys sitting on the mat, he said, we collaborate using Google Docs. Now that is the platform at Stonefield School that they have chosen for the students to collaborate and work together. Collaboration, you will hear, is a very, very important word in terms of our visible learning work. How do teachers collaborate? You saw those teachers at Stonefield School sitting around on the beanbags discussing action research. They were actually discussing their data wall. So the information and progress of every student is visible. That's in the staff room for teachers to discuss and to discuss progress. Progress is very, very important and is a very key part of what we talk about in the visible learning research. So we had students talking about their learning. We had Sarah talking about the things that she has done. And there's something I want you to know. A colleague of mine came from where he works in London to New Zealand recently, and he had seen that video, and he was very cynical about the video. He said, I bet that I could walk into any school in any country in the world and put a microphone in front of selected students, and they could talk like that. And he went to Stonefield School, and he almost interrogated the children at the school about their learning, because he wanted to believe or to know that all students at Stonefield School could talk like that about their learning. He was not disappointed. Every student in the school talks about their learning in that way. So it's not isolated. It is a deliberate, evidence-based way of teaching and learning that Sarah and the management team at the school have initiated in collaboration with parents. So parents, for example, come in on Google Docs as well, and they actually use that platform for looking at student work. So what I would like you to do is to take a few moments to talk at your tables about the video. What were the students able to do that surprised you? What are the things that really leapt out to you that you would like to talk about? And how relevant is that to you in your schools? I'm going to give you a few minutes to talk about that. Okay. Thank you, Isabel. And you noticed that I was moving around the room as you were talking, because it's very important for me to try to understand what some of the issues are for you and what some of the realities are like for you in your schools. Isabel mentioned to me as I was walking up here that some people were asking about the leadership of the teachers in those situations. Do you know, the teachers in those classrooms know more about those students and where they're at in their learning than I have ever seen before in any other school. The teachers are activators of student learning. They know intimately where those students are at, deeply where those students are at, and are making sure they're activating learning for the students. There is no way that those teachers step back from their role as being teachers. Explicit instruction is part of what they do, obviously, in the school. But students have that huge ownership. So when we talk about visible learning, Sarah, as the leader of that school, and her leadership team have been very involved in working with John Hattie and the Visible Learning team, but they take the research from a whole lot of places around the world, and they really infuse that or make that part of what they're doing every day. Sarah is an instructional leader, and I'm going to talk about that in terms of the different types of leadership and the different types of leadership that have the biggest impact on student achievement. So I showed the video at the beginning because I wanted you to visualise what this looks like. We always, in the work that we do, start with the learners because they are the most important part of the whole discussion. And we want you to see what we mean. And now what I'm going to do is go backwards, if you like, and say, why is it that we've actually put the emphasis so strongly on having learners who are visible learners, having inspired and passionate teachers, and the different strands of visible learning that we have worked on? So I've worked with John Hattie now for well over 10 years. And it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to work with him. He's very interested in the fact that I'm here talking to you today, and we've had a number of conversations about the context that you have for teaching and learning here in Asia. So John's motivation for doing the research was to find out, he said, how come everybody keeps having bright ideas in education? And if you have been in education for as long as I have, you will have seen many wonderful ideas come and go. And John got frustrated by that. And he said, how come so many people keep having bright ideas, and teachers and educators and policymakers like ourselves keep lurching from one great idea to the other? And it disturbs John and I and the team because John gets invited to speak at nearly 2,000 events every year. And we know that there's a lot more to visible learning than talking for a day about the research. We know that actually it's more than just a bright idea. John's motivation for doing the research was to look around the world at the existing research and to say, I want to pull it together, bring it all together, and have a look at what actually does have the biggest impact on student achievement. Everything we do in our classrooms works. That is the good news. What we were looking at and what we continue to look at and research and now put into practice in schools and countries around the world is what works best. So this was the first book that John published on the visible learning research. It has got all of the meta-analyses, it's got all of the research summarised in there. It's also got the methodology that John used for collecting, collating, and categorising the research in there as well. As I said before, the research came from existing published and unpublished works. So the work of people like Michael Fullan, Ben Levin, and lots of other different researchers, Marzano, all of those researchers, all of the international research that's out there with the big names and the PhD theses as well, were all brought together into this piece of research. So it's pretty big and it's ongoing. John is constantly now updating and searching international databases for research around these components that he has categorised. But it was a huge process, and that's why I said it was about 20 years of work for John to categorise the research. One thing I want to point out to you, though, is that all of the research focused on student achievement. John wanted to know what actually has the biggest impact on achievement, students' results in education. We know as educators that there are a lot of things that are important to us in education. We also focus on physical health, well-being, all of those aspects of education. But John wanted to know what had the biggest impact on student achievement in this research. To do that, he actually collected together data that sometimes had baseline and, it all had baseline and endpoint data. So data collected at the beginning of an intervention and at the end of an intervention. Sometimes it was over multiple points. Some of the research has been 15 to 20 years long, so obviously data had been collected at various points across that time. Sometimes it was comparative data. It was comparing boys and girls, high schools or elementary schools to secondary schools. There were whole lots of different components pulled together. But one of the key things that it did was measure this notion of difference or growth. And growth in the visible learning work that we do is a really important component for us as educators to know what growth looks like. You could see Ben with his beehives actually taking the little bee and moving it up the beehive to look at the growth that he's making. You saw that the Murito was looking at the rocks, and that's why stone fields, and they had a rock wall. This is a connection to being in a quarry. They have puppets in the school too, and the puppets, there are 3 puppets. One of them's called Cliff, which has also got a connection to a quarry. I can't remember the other ones now, but they've all got kind of themes around the quarry, which is very entertaining. But the little children, the younger children, find it very safe to talk to those puppets as well about their learning. So they've really thought through and researched the ways they're going to be doing that. But they were looking at progress. Let's also be clear, because this is one thing that some people get very unsettled about. They say, you cannot put that up on the wall and compare people. That is not ethically correct. And I was in Stonefields at the end of last year, and I was talking to a group of about 8 students. And I said to them, look, when I go and talk to people around the world about the beehives and about the rock walls and about how you're showing progress, a lot of people get very upset. They say to me, you should not be comparing students in that way. What do you think about that? What should I say to those people? I said to the students. The students looked at me as if I was a little bit silly. They didn't understand my question because the way they work in their classroom is that is part of the collaboration that they have of working together. They have their rock walls, they have their beehives, so they can help each other. Now, they are sensitive to people who make very little progress, and they do put processes in place because some people make very little steps in their learning. So they are sensitive to that, but generally it's a very collaborative, supportive environment. Parents are part of the discussion, and it simply isn't an issue for those students. It's important that you know that, because they thought I was a little bit strange when I asked the question about that. In order for John to actually pull all this research together, he needed to find a metric. He needed to find a way of measuring, to be able to make that common comparison. And we work with a lot of schools now who are actually doing this kind of work as well, and they're using this metric, if you like, to actually pull together the different ways. We're great as educators at having different ways of measuring kids, measuring our students, whether it's by percentiles or reading ages or levels. We're very good at doing that. So John needed the common metric, and the metric he used is called an effect size. He needed the common scale, and the common scale has 0 where students are making no progress. Some things that we do in our schools actually make student learning go backwards. Well, I certainly don't want to be responsible personally for the students I have taught for their learning to go backwards. So I would like to know what the things are that make students' learning go backwards. I'm also quite interested in what those things are up in that enhanced area. What are the things that I can do? What are the things that I can focus on as a policy maker or as a school leader or a teacher that sits up that other end? When we look at the research internationally, and this is also replicated or repeated or shown in a lot of the assessment information we are collecting now in all of the work that we do in many countries around the world, the typical effect size or the measure of progress made for a student over the course of a year is 0.4 of an effect size. That's about 1 year's growth. So if we think of an effect size of 1 being about 2 to 3 years of growth in 1 year. We can see, though, that where we need to actually focus our attention as educators is from the 0.4 and above. We certainly don't want to focus our energies and efforts on things that make kids' learning go backwards. And we want to do a lot better than 0. What is the point of students coming to our classrooms if they make 0 progress? So the 0.4 is an important number for you to understand today. It is what we call our hinge point. This is the hinge from where everything kind of travels or moves from. So we calculate an effect size, and you can read a lot of research. Cohen's D is the effect size measure that we use, and it's been around since the 1980s. It's quite a familiar measurement term, and it's possible with the work that we're doing. We have a lot of teachers and schools actually using this calculation, using this measure to look at progress that students make over the course of the year. So for every student that's sitting in the school in the country that you work in today, they should be making 0.4 of an effect size progress over the course of a year. Another way of looking at it is this. The point 4 you can see above that is what we call our zone of desired effects. Then we've got our typical teacher effects, and you're going to see that in the list that I'm going to show you and the research I'm going to discuss with you soon. But even when students don't go to school, through the data and evidence collected in countries in the world where students don't attend school, students will still make progress. And then we've got some things below zero that make student learning go backwards. So 95% of everything from the research showed a positive influence on student achievement. And this is where John is very keen to say, all it takes is a beating heart in a classroom and students will learn. If your school leader, if your administrators, if your school managers wake up tomorrow and have another really good idea about what to do in your school, it will work. What we're interested in is what will work best. Another view of it, when we look at the distribution of the effects from the research, you can see the things, as we've got a normal distribution curve sitting there, the things then sitting there in red. There were not many things that made student learning go backwards. But we can see where the 0 point is at the end of the red, and then we can see where the positive impacts are. So when I was working with a school last year that over the course of the year did a particular intervention in literacy with their Year 5 students, they had an effect size of 1.56. That is a big effect size. And that was in a very, very low socioeconomic school, where there's a sense of urgency in that school to really accelerate the progress and the learning of the students. So the principal of the school sent us the data for the year and said, we got an effect size of 1.56 for our Year 5 students this year. Please check my numbers because it must be wrong. We checked the numbers and we said it is not wrong. Absolutely, you got an effect size of 1.56. Whatever you're doing, you need to esteem it. You need to share it with others. You need to treasure it. And that's one of the things that I think sometimes we're not very good at as educators, is really valuing the wonderful work that we are doing and sharing it with others. But to do that, you do need to know the impact that you're having. In the visible learning work that we do with schools, we're we emphasise very strongly that we're wanting schools to go through a process of reviewing and understanding and collecting evidence around many aspects of what's happening in their school, so they can identify the really great things that they're doing, so they can share them with other teachers in the school and maybe even other parts of the school. And then they can focus on the areas of weakness, the areas where they may need to put more effort and energy. But until you collect that evidence, you can't possibly know what it is you need to focus on. When John was putting the research together, he had to find a way to put it into categories. And the 6 categories are sitting there. There's the curriculum. So he wanted to know what were the curriculum effects. And we spend a lot of time changing school curriculums. I was responsible recently in New Zealand for the review of the New Zealand English curriculum. We spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money on changing a curriculum. John was wanting to know from this what curriculum effects there were on student achievement. What were the things that the student was bringing to the classroom that would have an effect on their learning? What about the school and the school systems? It's things like timetable. What effects do they have? What about the effects from the home? The teacher and the different approaches to teaching. So different programs for teaching were looked at as well. So John put everything into categories in terms of the research. So these are some of the things that we found in the research. I'm starting at 150. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the bottom effects because we really need to focus on the top ones. But you can see in the table we have got the rank, so it's from 150 up to the very top one that you're going to see soon, which is the number one effect. You've got the number of studies that were included in this piece of analysis. And then in every study that was collected, sometimes there were different effects actually being measured. Different aspects were being measured. So sometimes they have a lot more than one effect. And then you've got the effect size itself. So already we can see that mobility, which means shifting schools, actually has a negative impact on students' achievement. Now, I was working in a school last year where one student had shifted 9 times during the year. Now, that's a lot of shifting. I don't know what the context is for you, for students shifting schools, and whether or not it is an issue here. But one of the ways that the research says to mitigate against shifting schools is if a student makes a friend within the first month to 6 weeks. Now, for a student who shifted 9 times in a year, that's a lot of friends to make, isn't it? So what processes and programs and supports do you have in place for students who are shifting schools? Remembering if they make a friend within the first month to 6 weeks, we can start to mitigate that. And we look at some of these low effects and we talk about how can we mitigate against these effects? How can we put things in place to actually level those effects out? Holding students back a year. It is a practice that happens quite a lot in countries around the world, we have found, where a student is held back from going from grade 4 to grade 5 to grade 6. We could find no evidence at all that it has any positive impact on student achievement. None. And we always find in audiences that we work with that somebody says, yes, but my auntie's mother's brother's cousin was held back and it didn't hurt them. And we say, that's fantastic. We suggest that you actually publish that because nobody has ever published anything yet that we could find that says it's positive. So for a lot of countries, a lot of places we work, that's a very challenging statistic. In fact, I was talking to a teacher or a school leader actually in Tokyo last week, and they were considering holding a group of students back from progressing up to the next level next year. And we had a really in-depth conversation about some of the things they might like to consider there. We know the effect, and we've talked about, you probably know the effect of summer vacation. Summer vacation or stopping learning can make students' learning go backwards, particularly in mathematics, to a lesser extent in languages and language acquisition. So we talk about, once again, how can we mitigate against that? How can we make sure that when students come to our classrooms on day 1 of the new school year, that we start the learning immediately? And I don't know if your classrooms are a lot like some of the ones I go into, where day 1 is us getting to know each other. You know, by week 3, we've kind of almost started learning in a lot of classrooms I work in. So where is the sense of urgency to mitigate against that summer effect? And I think this might come up too when Leanne talks this afternoon and we have some discussion. The open versus traditional learning spaces, it doesn't matter if you have open plan spaces or if you have traditional classrooms. And once again, a lot of places I work have spent a lot of money on open plan learning spaces. And they think that that is going to be the answer to effective teaching and learning. Of course, we know it's not. It's the quality of the teacher in this space that is going to make the difference. Recently, working in Australia, the government has spent a lot of money on open plan learning spaces. It's what happens in the spaces that is important. Changing the school calendar. The research in this area was about shortening the school year, not having less time or greater holidays, but actually just changing where the holidays are. And it was seen that it really had very little impact on student learning. And it's a whole lot of new research that's come out recently that some of you may want to read more about. Now, for those of you who think, I would like to know more about that particular piece of research, the book, and Leanne I think has got the book over there, I think Isabel's got it there as well. The book actually goes into the research in quite a lot of detail. And then sometimes everything is referenced in the book. So you can go to the original piece of research and actually find that and read it. So if there's something in particular you're interested in, you can do that. Teacher subject matter knowledge causes great concern to people because it sits at 0.09. And we would say, of course, if I'm a teacher and I've got deep knowledge of my subject area, then I'm going to be much, much better as a teacher. Well, there are a number of factors you need to consider. Number one, you may be an expert in your curriculum area, but that does not mean that your teaching skills or your pedagogy is really fantastic or really great. We need to think about that. The other thing that John and his colleague Richard Jager have been doing, have been looking at the research around teacher subject matter knowledge and doing their own research. And we would suggest that a lot of the classroom teaching in the research we have been doing, a lot of the teaching is at a very surface level. So if I said to you that the teacher down the road in the school just down the road has had to go home sick today, and I would like you to go in there and teach that class, and by the way, they're learning Egyptian hieroglyphics, most of us could do it. Most of us could stay a page ahead of the students and teach Egyptian hieroglyphics at that very surface level, but we would not have the knowledge to go deep. So a lot of the classrooms that we see a lot of very surface level teaching. Of course, if you are teaching in a very deep and considered way and really moving students through those levels of processing, then you do need to have a really deep level of teacher subject matter knowledge. So this one concerns us, and it's an area where we're doing a lot of research and a lot of thinking as well. And I'm going to be interested in your thoughts around that this afternoon when Leanne talks to you. Gender, the effect size there actually favours boys. Boys have a slightly better advantage than girls overall in terms of their achievement outcomes, but it depends also on the country that you're in. So for example, if I'm in Bahrain, it is better to be a boy in terms of my education, whereas if I live in Liechtenstein, you actually have an advantage if you're a girl. So this data and this particular set of information is also covered in the book, and you need to read that in more details. But gender overall, when you take it overall, all the countries in the world, there is not a big difference. Ability grouping refers to streaming classes, having the bright students, the middle students, and the less able students in streams. And you can see there that ability grouping does not have a particularly high effect size. In fact, in the research that we've looked at, a lot of the classes of the lower ability classes have teachers who are less qualified, less experienced, and in actual fact, those classrooms are rather deadening places to be. So what does that mean for students? And John Hattie was involved in a very large court case in the United States a few years ago around equality and equity in education in terms of students who were put into those lower tracked classes. So we need to consider that in terms of our policies. What are we doing? What are you doing in terms of your policy around ability grouping or streaming students? The school, once again, I was working in last year, decided to, well, this is a retention one really, but they actually decided to hold students back and not actually put them into those next classes. And in actual fact, by March, or by only 2 months into the school year, all of those students, all 16 of them, had left school. So they're the kinds of issues that we're looking at in terms of how we take the research and actually use it. Matching learning styles. We have a lot sweeping the world around learning styles. Are you a kinesthetic, a visual and auditory learner? Really has very little impact. We shouldn't be labelling our students like that. We should be thinking about ways in for our students, and certainly if a student actually has a preferred way of learning, we use that as an entry point into then actually introducing other ways of learning for the student as well. You're not going to be successful in the world if you are just simply a kinesthetic learner for all of your life. We need to actually have other ways of learning too. So when we think about the work of Howard Gardner and multiple intelligences work that some of you may be familiar with, even that kind of thinking, even Howard Gardner would say, sometimes gets taken and misused. It's one of the dangers of our research as well. Sometimes some of our research gets taken and misused for particular reasons. And that really leads me into the next one, which I'm going to talk about, which is class size. Class size is a very big issue in many countries in the world. And class size really does not make a huge difference on student achievement. And teachers don't like to hear that. They think that if they've got fewer students in their classes, of course they're going to teach better. And most of us would think, well, it's going to give me the time to do all the things that are at the top of the effect size chart that you're going to see shortly. But in actual fact, the research says that if you take a class of 30 students and one teacher and change it to a class of 20 students and one teacher, if the teacher doesn't change their practice, then nothing changes for the students. So it may improve teacher working conditions, but it doesn't necessarily improve student achievement unless you combine it with the things that sit at the top of the effect size chart. Now, this is something that governments around the world have taken, and they've said, John Hattie says that class size doesn't make a difference. Therefore, we're going to increase our class sizes. And we go, no, that's not what we mean. Number one, it does improve student achievement by 0.21, but it doesn't improve it to the extent that we would expect it to. So if we were to take reduce class sizes and then take our teachers and give them some new strategies and new thinking and new ways of working in their classrooms, then yes, it will improve student achievement. So we need to think about things like class size in the context of whole lots of other parts of the research, but we also get concerned when people take the research and use it for political purposes. We have no control over that, but it does happen. So at the moment, John's work has just been translated into German, and every day we're getting emails from very angry and frustrated German teachers sometimes who are saying, it is having a negative impact on what policies are being put in place in Germany. And the discussion is about saying the things that teachers don't do well, and it's about being really hard on teachers. And that disturbs us, because that is not the intention of our work at all. So we run the risk of it being used for different purposes. Individualized instruction, 0.22. We would expect it to be more. In fact, a lot of people would rank it up there at the top. But what we're seeing and what you saw in the video was students working together, collaborating. And if you actually have individualized instruction, you don't have that opportunity for students to teach someone else. And one of the greatest ways that students can learn is actually to teach someone else. So individualized instruction doesn't have the impact we might expect. Summer school. Summer school has a bigger impact for students who who are kind of in a position, I think, where they need to make some urgent gains, where they've got some issues in particular areas. Summer school, the research says, has a bigger impact for students in terms of mathematics rather than language, once again, and also has a bigger impact when it's really targeted to student needs, not just a blanket program or one program for everybody. So when it's really targeted to student needs, when it's in mathematics, it has a bigger impact, and when parents are involved in the process as well, once again, it is one of the indicators of success of summer school. But it's not at the hinge point, which is the point 4. So it certainly can be beneficial, and it may come up for discussion this afternoon. Teaching, test taking, or coaching for tests sits at point 27. And let's be clear, we make a real distinction in the work that we do between student achievement, which is the results that they get, maybe the test results that they get, and student learning. And sometimes we work with schools where the students are getting fantastic results. They're very, very high achievers. And we say that actually what we're wanting is for our students to be good learners. Our students may be very able, but if they actually hit a road bump, or they hit a problem, or they hit a challenge, or something they don't know, are they resilient? Do they have strategies for coping with that? So we need to think really about the whole student, not just preparing them for tests, which is going to have a short-term effect, but how can we actually work with our students to have long-term and holistic effects on their lives and their education and their futures. So we're saying that when we have all the visible learning strategies in place, and when we have students control of their own learning, all of the things that we're talking about today, they are going to achieve fantastic results, and we have the evidence to prove that. But by teaching test taking, we're going to get short-term results, but not give our learners those skills to be lifelong learners with strategies to deal with things when things go wrong. Homework has a 0.29 effect size. And this is an interesting one. This is one that has what we call a moderating effect. And where there are different effects, say for boys or girls or high school or primary school, we're really keen to point that out. And this is one of them. The effect of homework for primary school students is about 0. About 0. But the effect of homework for high school students is about 0.59. When you average those out, though, over all students, it comes out at 0.29, when you average all of the studies out. So what does that mean for us in terms of what we're doing in our schools? Because we're not saying get rid of homework, because a lot of our parents judge the quality of our school by the amount of homework we give them. We're saying we need to be really smart about the homework that we do give our students. And some of the ways to get the biggest impact from homework for younger students, and when I say younger students, there's some new research just come out of Australia over the last 2 months that is saying that homework really does not have a positive effect, a significant positive effect, until the students are about 15 years old. So one way to really maximise the effect or get the biggest effect from homework for younger students, there are 3 things that the research says to do. One is to keep it relevant to what you have been doing during the class that day. So it's reinforcing a mathematics concept, it's reinforcing an aspect of literacy learning, it's reinforcing some science concepts, but absolutely relevant to today. You keep it brief, and by brief, we'd say 10 minutes or less. Brief. And the other thing that you have to do is to mark it, or acknowledge it, or give it feedback in some way. So this is quite a different way of thinking to those great long research projects or projects. You know, I want you to do a project and we'll mark it in 2 weeks' time. We're talking about maximising, getting the biggest impact from homework. Brief, relevant, and market. So what does that mean in terms of the homework policies you have got in your schools or your district users? What does that mean for you? One of the most effective schools that we've been working with lately, the parents are coming in and working with the teachers to actually be assigning homework. Because for a lot of our students, homework simply reinforces for them that they cannot do the work. And sometimes a lot of the homes that the homework goes back to, the parents also don't have the skills or the knowledge to be able to help. So by giving those long-term projects, it can have a very negative effect on students and their learning and their perceptions and their beliefs about themselves as learners. So brief, relevant to today, and market, and we can see bigger impacts from homework. And getting our parent community involved in that. Inquiry-based teaching. And I know I've spoken to some people here this morning who are teaching the IB program in schools, which is totally got an inquiry-based approach. Inquiry, when it's actually got a scaffold or a structure around it, is far more useful than simply handing over to the students and saying, I want you to go and find out about rain, for example, where some students have got no way in, they've got no strategies to know even when to start or where to start. And sometimes we do our students a disservice when we're not actually giving them those scaffolds to actually access the learning that we're wanting them to do. So when we talk about inquiry-based teaching, in many countries in the world, some teachers get very upset because that is the philosophy or the thinking or the big new wave that is sweeping a lot of places in the world. So they don't like hearing the message that actually it's sitting there at 0.31, which is pretty high, but it's not at the hinge point. So we say scaffold it. Give students the way into that so they can successfully actually inquire. Like the students could at Stonefields, they were doing something they were calling breakthrough. And you heard, I think it was Ruby talking about doing breakthroughs. You can do anything, go beyond the limits, but they do have very structured ways into that and supports for students to do it. Look at decreasing disruptive behaviour sitting on 0.34. We cannot underestimate the effect that disruptive behaviour actually has on other students and their learning. But we can, as educators, mitigate against it. And it doesn't mean, in many classrooms that I go into, that you simply get rid of, ask the naughty ones to leave and put them in a different room. But what strategies are we using to actually manage that? And how are we collaborating as education professionals to discuss that in our schools? Principals and school leaders, the good news for you is that you sit nearly at the hinge point. You're nearly at 0.4. But once again, we have got moderating effects. And those moderating effects make a distinction in the research between different types of leadership. And I'm sure many of you will have read a lot about leadership and different leadership styles, distributed leadership, all sorts of types of leadership. And we have whole institutes devoted to talking about leadership. From the research that we have included in the visible learning research and the meta-analysis and the pulling together of this information, we look at this difference between instructional and transformational. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. So that's got cut off down the bottom. So I want you to have a look at this and just spend a moment looking at the different lists, transformational leadership and instructional leadership. And think about the schools that you work with or the leaders that you work with and which type of leaders are they? Have they got a tendency to lean to transformational or instructional? So I'm just going to give you a few moments to read through the list. That bottom one is you can see it is there, a high degree of autonomy for this school. I think that is it. Let's find it. So a couple of minutes. So people who are online, I'm just giving people a couple of moments to talk about the two lists, the transformational and instructional leadership that are on the screen. Take a moment to talk.